It was a bright, sunny afternoon in Pinewood Estates. This place was a small, quiet neighborhood, a spot where houses sat neatly in rows, with green lawns and little mailboxes out front. Kids rode bikes down the street, dogs barked now and then, and most people just did their own thing. They waved hello, watered their flowers, and went about their day. It was peaceful. Usually, everyone minded their own business. Everyone, that is, except for one lady named Karen McAllister. Karen wasn't like the other neighbors. Oh no, she was different. To everyone in Pinewood Estates, she was the HOA president. HOA stands for Homeowners Association. It's like a club that makes rules for the neighborhood. And Karen? She loved being in charge of that club. She was bossy. She was loud. And she always carried a little notepad in her hand, scribbling things down like she was the queen of the whole street. If your grass grew too tall, scribble, scribble. If your garbage can sat out too long, scribble, scribble. Karen acted like she owned every house, every yard, every single blade of grass in Pinewood Estates. People didn't argue with her. They just rolled their eyes and hoped she'd go away. But there was one person who didn't roll his eyes. That person was Jake Larson. To Karen, Jake was just a regular guy, a new neighbor who moved into a small house at the end of the block. Jake's house wasn't fancy. It had a tiny front porch, a plain white door, and a little backyard with a picnic table. Jake liked it that way. He was a quiet guy who just wanted to live his life. He wanted to sit on his porch with a glass of lemonade. He wanted to eat sandwiches at his picnic table. He wanted to plant some flowers and maybe get a dog someday. That's all he asked for, peace and quiet. But Karen? She wouldn't let him have it. To her, Jake was a problem. A big, annoying problem. See, Jake had only been in Pinewood Estates for a few weeks when Karen started bothering him. The very first day he moved in, she showed up at his door. She didn't knock or say hi like a normal neighbor. Nope. She just stood there on his porch, tapping her foot, holding that notepad like it was a weapon. "Your moving truck parked too close to my driveway," she said, her voice sharp and loud. Jake blinked at her. He didn't know what to say. He just nodded and mumbled, "Okay, I'll move it." Karen huffed, wrote something in her notepad, and marched off. Jake thought that would be the end of it. Boy, was he wrong. The next day, Karen was back. This time, she didn't even stay on the porch. She walked right into Jake's front yard, her shoes stomping on his grass. "Your mailbox is too bright," she yelled. Jake had painted it blue, his favorite color. He thought it looked cool. But Karen? She hated it. "Blue isn't allowed," she said, waving her notepad in the air. "Change it, or I'll write you up." Jake didn't argue. He just said, "Sure," and watched her storm away. He didn't want trouble. He just wanted to enjoy his new home. But Karen kept coming back. Day after day, she found something new to complain about. One time, she said his grass was too long even though he'd mowed it the day before. Another time, she said his picnic table was ugly and didn't match the neighborhood. She even complained about the way he parked his car in his own driveway. Every time she showed up, she'd yell, point, and scribble in that notepad. To Karen, Jake was just some new guy who didn't know the rules. She thought he was weak. She thought he'd do whatever she said. She thought she could boss him around forever. But here's the thing Karen didn't know, Jake wasn't as ordinary as he looked. Sure, he was quiet. Sure, he didn't yell back at her. Sure, he smiled and nodded when she bossed him around. But deep down, Jake was smart. Really smart. He wasn't the kind of guy to let someone walk all over him forever. He had a trick up his sleeve, a big, sneaky trick that Karen would never expect. She thought she was the boss of Pinewood Estates. She thought she could keep bothering Jake and get away with it. But Jake? He was watching. He was waiting. And he was planning something that would make her wish she'd left him alone. Let's picture Jake for a minute. He wasn't tall or loud or scary. He was just a regular guy with brown hair and a friendly smile. He wore plain shirts and jeans, and he drove an old pickup truck. When you looked at him, you'd think, oh, that's just Jake. That's what everyone thought, even Karen. But Jake had a secret. He wasn't just some new neighbor who'd let her push him around. He was a guy who liked to fix things. He liked to build stuff. Back where he used to live, he'd made all kinds of cool things: birdhouses, shelves, even a little robot that rolled around his yard. Jake loved figuring out how stuff worked. And now, in Pinewood Estates, he was figuring out something new: how to deal with Karen. See, every time Karen came by, Jake didn't just stand there feeling mad. He paid attention. He noticed how she walked right into his yard like it was hers. He saw how she poked her nose into everything: his mailbox, his grass, his picnic table. He heard her loud voice barking orders. And every time she left, Jake would sit on his porch, sip his lemonade, and think. He'd think about what she said. He'd think about what she did. And he'd start to smile a little, sneaky smile that nobody saw. Karen thought he was scared of her. She thought he'd never fight back. But Jake wasn't scared. He was plotting. The neighborhood didn't know it yet, but something big was coming. Karen didn't know it either. She kept strutting around Pinewood Estates, bossing everyone around, thinking she was the queen. She'd yell at Mr. Thompson for leaving his bike on the lawn. She'd snap at Mrs. Garcia for planting pink flowers instead of red ones. And she'd stomp over to Jake's house every chance she got, ready to find something new to complain about. To her, Jake was just another neighbor she could boss around. Just another guy who'd listen to her rules. But Jake? He was different. He wasn't going to let her win. Let's go back to that sunny afternoon in Pinewood Estates. The day was warm, the sky was blue, and the birds were chirping in the trees. Kids rode their bikes past Jake's house, laughing and shouting. Mrs. Garcia watered her flowers across the street. Mr. Thompson mowed his lawn a few houses down. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed calm. But over at Jake's little house, things were about to get interesting. Jake was in his backyard that afternoon. He sat at his picnic table, the one Karen hated, with a pencil and a piece of paper. He was drawing something. Lines and circles and little squiggles. He'd scribble, then erase, then scribble some more. His pickup truck was parked in the driveway, and his bright blue mailbox stood proudly by the road. The grass was short, the porch was clean, and the sun shone down on everything. It looked like a perfect day. But then, here came Karen. She marched down the sidewalk, her shoes clicking loud on the pavement. Her notepad was tucked under her arm, and her eyes were narrowed. She stopped right in front of Jake's house, put her hands on her hips, and stared. She stared at the mailbox. She stared at the grass. She stared at the picnic table where Jake was sitting. Then she took a big step forward right onto Jake's yard. She didn't ask. She didn't knock. She just walked in, like she owned the place. "Your table is still here," she shouted, pointing at it. Jake looked up from his paper. He didn't say anything. He just watched her. "I told you last week, this table doesn't fit the neighborhood. It's ugly. Move it, or I'll fine you." Karen's voice was loud enough to scare the birds out of the trees. She flipped open her notepad and started writing. Scribble, scribble, scribble. Jake stayed quiet. He put his pencil down and leaned back in his chair. Karen kept going. "And your grass? It's patchy. Fix it." She stomped her foot, crushing a little flower Jake had planted. If you were there, you'd think Jake would get mad. You'd think he'd yell back or tell her to leave. But he didn't. He just sat there, looking at her. His face didn't change. He didn't frown or shout. He just watched. And if you looked close, really, really close, you might have seen that little smile again. That sneaky, secret smile. Karen didn't see it. She was too busy yelling. She didn't know Jake was thinking. She didn't know he was planning. She didn't know he had a trick up his sleeve. Karen finished her rant and turned to leave. "You better fix this, Jake," she called over her shoulder. "I'll be back tomorrow." She marched off, her notepad flapping in the wind. Jake waited until she was gone. Then he picked up his pencil and went back to his drawing. He added a few more lines. He drew a box with a button on it. He smiled bigger this time, not a secret smile, but a real one. Something was coming. Something Karen wouldn't like. Something that would change everything. So, here's a question for you: what would you do if someone kept snooping around your yard? Would you yell at them? Would you tell them to go away? Or would you do something sneaky, like Jake? Think about it. Drop your answer in the comments below, because I want to know. And stick around, because Jake's about to show us his answer, and trust me, it's a good one. Jake wasn't ordinary. Karen didn't know it yet, but she was about to find out. That sunny afternoon in Pinewood Estates? It was just the beginning. The neighborhood was quiet for now, but not for long. Karen thought she was the boss. She thought she could keep bossing Jake around. But Jake had other plans. He had a big, surprising trick that would make her wish she'd never stepped into his yard. What was it? You'll see soon. Just keep reading, because this story's about to get wild. Karen McAllister was trouble. Big trouble. She had this annoying, pesky habit of poking her nose where it didn't belong. She didn't just stay on her own side of the street in Pinewood Estates. Oh no. Every single day, she'd march right onto Jake Larson's property like she owned it. Her shoes would stomp on his grass, her loud voice would echo through the air, and she'd always have that clipboard in her hand. That clipboard was her favorite thing. She carried it everywhere, holding it tight like it gave her superpowers. And when she got to Jake's house, she'd start barking orders like a bossy dog. Your grass is too long, she'd yell, pointing at Jake's lawn. It didn't matter that Jake had mowed it just a few days ago. To Karen, it was never good enough. That shed's an eyesore, she'd shout next, glaring at the little wooden shed in Jake's backyard. Jake had built that shed himself. It wasn't fancy, just a small box with a roof to keep his tools dry, but he liked it. Karen didn't. She hated it. She'd scribble something mean in her clipboard and shake her head. And then get this, she even complained about the color of his mailbox. Jake's mailbox was bright blue. He picked that color because it made him happy. Every time he saw it, he'd smile. But Karen? She'd say, blue isn't allowed. It's ugly. Change it right now. She'd wave her clipboard like she was the queen of colors. The neighbors in Pinewood Estates knew all about Karen. They'd see her stomping around, yelling at people, and they'd whisper to each other. There goes Karen again, they'd say behind her back. She's so bossy. Mr. Thompson, who lived 2 houses down, would shake his head when Karen told him his bike was too messy on his porch. Mrs. Garcia, across the street, would sigh when Karen complained about her pink flowers. Everyone talked about her. But nobody dared to argue. Nobody wanted to fight with Karen. She was loud, she was mean, and she had that clipboard. It scared them. So they just nodded and let her boss them around. Jake, though. He was different. When Karen came to his house, he didn't yell back. He didn't argue. He didn't tell her to go away. He just stayed quiet. Too quiet, maybe. He'd stand there on his porch or in his yard, listening to her shout. Your grass is too long, she'd say. Jake would nod. That shed's an eyesore, she'd bark. Jake would smile a little, a tiny, polite smile. Fix that mailbox, she'd snap. Jake would look at her, say nothing, and watch her stomp off down the sidewalk. To anyone watching, it looked like Jake didn't care. It looked like he was okay with Karen being mean. But that wasn't true. Inside, Jake wasn't calm. Inside, he was boiling. Like a pot of water on the stove, bubbling and bubbling, ready to spill over. He was mad. Really mad. But he didn't show it. Not yet. Karen didn't see the boiling. She didn't notice how Jake's eyes followed her when she left. She didn't think about why he stayed so quiet. To her, Jake was a pushover. A pushover is someone who's easy to boss around, someone who won't fight back. Karen thought Jake was weak. She thought he'd always do what she said, no matter how mean she got. She'd laugh to herself as she walked away, thinking, that Jake guy is scared of me. I'm in charge here. Big mistake. Huge mistake. Karen didn't know it, but she was wrong about Jake. So wrong. Her snarky comments kept coming. Snarky means rude and mean, and Karen was the champion of snarky. One day, she marched onto Jake's yard again. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and Jake was sitting at his picnic table, drinking lemonade. He liked that table. It was old and wooden, with a few scratches, but it was his. Karen didn't care. She walked right up, stepped over his flower bed, squashing a little yellow flower he'd planted, and sneered at him. You're lucky I don't fine you, she said. A fine is when you have to pay money for breaking a rule. Karen loved threatening people with fines. She'd say it all the time, I'll fine you. I'll fine you. She thought it made her powerful. That day, she stood there, hands on her hips, glaring at Jake. Your yard's a mess. You're lucky I don't make you pay, she said again, louder this time. Then she turned and stomped off, leaving muddy footprints on his grass. Jake didn't say a word. He just sat there, holding his lemonade glass. His hands squeezed it tight. If you looked close, you'd see his fists clench a little. Clench means to squeeze hard, like when you're really mad but trying not to show it. That's what Jake did. He clenched his fists, but his face stayed calm. He didn't yell. He didn't jump up and chase her. He just watched her go. Quietly. Too quietly. What was he thinking? What was he planning? You'll find out soon, but let's keep going for now. Another day, Karen came back. This time, it was early in the morning. Jake was still in his pajamas, drinking coffee on his porch. The air was cool, and the neighborhood was quiet until Karen showed up. Clip-clop went her shoes on the sidewalk. She stopped at Jake's house, looked around, and marched right up to his porch. Your shed is still there, she shouted, pointing at it. I told you it's ugly. Get rid of it. Jake sipped his coffee and nodded. Just a little nod. Karen wasn't done. She stepped closer right onto his porch this time and pointed at his mailbox. And that blue thing. I said change it. Do it, or I'll write you up. She flipped open her clipboard and started scribbling. Scribble, scribble, scribble. Jake watched her. He didn't say anything. He just sipped his coffee and smiled that tiny smile. Karen kept going. You're making this neighborhood look bad, she snapped. I'm the HOA president, and I say what goes. Fix everything, or else. Then she turned around and stomped off again. Her clipboard flapped in the wind, and her voice echoed down the street. Jake stayed on his porch. He finished his coffee, set the mug down, and leaned back in his chair. His fists clenched again just for a second. Then he relaxed. He looked calm. Too calm. Inside, though, he wasn't calm at all. Inside, he was boiling hotter than ever. This kept happening. Day after day, Karen would show up. Sometimes it was about the grass. Too long, she'd yell. Sometimes it was the shed. Too ugly, she'd say. Sometimes it was the mailbox. Too blue, she'd scream. She'd even find new things to complain about, like the way Jake's truck was parked or how his picnic table had a little dirt on it. Every time, she'd march in, yell her orders, and scribble in that clipboard. And every time, Jake would stay quiet. He'd nod. He'd smile. He'd watch her leave. The neighbors saw it too. They'd peek out their windows and whisper. Poor Jake, they'd say. Karen's so mean to him. Why doesn't he do something? But Jake was doing something. He wasn't just sitting there being a pushover. He was thinking. He was watching. Every time Karen came by, he'd notice little things. Like how she always stepped on his flowers. Or how she stood too close to his shed. Or how she never knocked before walking onto his property. He'd sit on his porch after she left, sipping lemonade or coffee, and think about it all. He'd think about her loud voice. He'd think about her mean words. He'd think about that clipboard. And slowly, very slowly, that boiling inside him turned into something else. It turned into a plan. Karen didn't know about the plan. She didn't even guess. She thought Jake was easy to boss around. She thought he'd never fight back. One afternoon, she came by again. This time, it was hot outside. The sun was blazing, and Jake was watering his grass with a hose. Karen marched up, her face red from the heat, and started yelling. Your grass is patchy, she said. And that shed, it's still there. And that mailbox, ugh, I hate that blue. She stepped right into his yard, splashing water from the hose onto her shoes. She didn't care. She kept yelling. You better fix this, Jake. I'm tired of telling you. You're lucky I don't fine you right now. She scribbled in her clipboard and glared at him. Jake turned off the hose. He looked at her. His fists clenched again tight, So tight, but he didn't say anything. He just nodded, smiled that tiny smile, and watched her stomp away. Karen laughed as she left. What a pushover, she muttered to herself. She thought she'd won. She thought Jake was scared. She thought she could keep coming back forever. But she was wrong. Jake wasn't scared. He wasn't weak. He was boiling, and that boiling was about to turn into something big. What was he planning? Oh, you'll find out soon. It's going to be good. Really good. Jake wasn't going to let Karen boss him around forever. He had something up his sleeve, something sneaky, something smart, something that would make Karen wish she'd stayed away. She thought he was a pushover. She thought she was in charge. Big mistake. Huge mistake. The tension was building, like a storm getting ready to break. Karen didn't see it coming. But Jake? He was ready. And Pinewood Estates was about to see something they'd never forget. Karen kept coming back to Jake's house like it was her job. She didn't care about the sunny days or the quiet mornings. She didn't care that Jake just wanted to enjoy his little house in peace. To her, Jake's yard was her playground, a place where she could yell, point, and boss him around. And every time she showed up, she made sure to be extra loud. Her voice would bounce off the houses in Pinewood Estates, making dogs bark and kids stop riding their bikes to stare. She loved that. She loved being the center of attention. She loved thinking she was the boss of everyone, especially Jake. One afternoon, it was super windy outside. The trees were swaying, and leaves were blowing all over the street. Jake was raking his yard, trying to keep it neat. He had a big pile of leaves by his picnic table, and he was sweating a little from the work. Karen saw him from down the road and marched right over. Her hair was blowing in the wind, but she didn't care. She had her clipboard, and that's all that mattered. She stepped onto Jake's grass, crunching some leaves under her shoes, and started yelling. "Your yard looks awful," she shouted. "These leaves are everywhere. And that shed, it's still here. I told you to get rid of it." She pointed at the shed like it was the worst thing she'd ever seen. Jake stopped raking. He leaned on his rake and looked at her. "I'm cleaning it up," he said quietly. But Karen didn't listen. She never listened. "Clean faster," she snapped. "And that mailbox blue is so ugly. Change it, or I'll fine you." She scribbled in her clipboard, the wind almost ripping the paper out of her hands. Jake didn't say anything else. He just nodded slowly, like always, and smiled that tiny, polite smile. Karen glared at him. "You're lucky I don't make you pay right now," she said. Then she turned and stomped off, her shoes kicking up more leaves as she went. Jake watched her go. The wind blew his hair a little, but he didn't move. His fists clenched around the rake handle just for a second. Then he let go and started raking again. If you were there, you'd think he was fine. You'd think he didn't care about Karen's yelling. But inside, Jake was boiling hotter than a summer day. He was mad. Really, really mad. Every time Karen came by, that boiling got worse. Every mean word, every stomp on his grass, every scribble in that clipboard, it all piled up inside him like a big stack of firewood, just waiting for a match. The next morning, it happened again. The sun was just coming up, painting the sky orange and pink. Jake was in his backyard, fixing a loose board on his shed. He had a hammer in one hand and a nail in the other, tapping it into place. It was early, too early for most people to be awake. But not Karen. She came stomping down the street, her clipboard ready. She didn't even say hi. She just walked right into Jake's yard, stood by his shed, and started yelling. "What are you doing?" she shouted. "That shed is ugly. I told you to take it down, not fix it." Jake stopped hammering. He turned to look at her, the nail still in his hand. "It's mine," he said softly. "I like it." Karen's face turned red. "I don't care if you like it," she barked. "It doesn't fit the neighborhood. Get rid of it. And that mailbox still blue. Fix it." She stepped closer, almost knocking over a little flower pot Jake had set out. She didn't notice. She just kept yelling. "You're making this place look bad, Jake. Do what I say, or I'll write you up." She flipped open her clipboard and scribbled some more. Scribble, scribble, scribble. Jake watched her. He didn't move. He didn't yell back. He just stood there, holding his hammer, smiling that tiny smile. Karen finished her scribbling and pointed at him. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said. "You better fix this, or you're in big trouble." Then she turned and marched away, her loud steps waking up half the neighborhood. Jake waited until she was gone. Then he tapped the nail into the shed one more time, tap, 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 and went back to work. His fists clenched again, just for a moment. Then he relaxed. He looked calm. Too calm. But inside, that boiling was growing. It was bubbling up, getting ready to spill over. Karen thought she was winning. She thought Jake was scared. She thought she could keep doing this forever. She was so wrong. Days turned into weeks, and Karen didn't stop. She'd show up at all different times. Sometimes it was morning, when Jake was eating breakfast on his porch. She'd yell about his grass. Sometimes it was afternoon, when he was reading a book by his picnic table. She'd complain about his shed. Sometimes it was evening, when he was watering his flowers. She'd snap about his mailbox. It didn't matter what time it was, Karen always had something mean to say. And every time, she'd step right onto his property like it was hers. She'd yell, she'd point, she'd scribble. And every time, Jake would stay quiet. He'd nod. He'd smile. He'd watch her leave. The neighbors started noticing more. They'd see Karen stomping over to Jake's house, and they'd peek out their windows. "She's at it again," Mr. Thompson would say, shaking his head. "Poor Jake," Mrs. Garcia would whisper, watering her flowers. "Why doesn't he tell her to stop?" they'd ask each other. They felt bad for Jake. They thought he was too nice. They thought he was letting Karen win. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know what was going on inside Jake's head. They didn't see the boiling. They didn't see the plan. One day, it got even worse. It was a Saturday, and Jake was painting his front door. He'd picked a light green color, nothing crazy, just something to make his house feel like home. He had a paintbrush in his hand, dipping it into a can, making nice, even strokes. The sun was out, the air was warm, and he was humming a little song to himself. Then came Karen. Clip-clop down the sidewalk. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the green door. Her eyes got wide, and her mouth dropped open. "What are you doing?" she screamed, marching onto his porch. "Green? Green. You can't paint your door green. That's against the rules." Jake stopped painting. He turned to her, paintbrush dripping a little on the porch. "I like green," he said simply. Karen's face turned purple. "I don't care what you like," she yelled. "This isn't your neighborhood, it's mine. Change it back, or I'll fine you." She stepped closer, almost knocking over the paint can. She didn't care. She just kept shouting. "And that shed. Still there. And that mailbox still blue. You're breaking every rule, Jake. You're lucky I don't call the police." She scribbled in her clipboard so hard the pen almost broke. Jake didn't move. He held his paintbrush and looked at her. His fists clenched just a tiny bit, then relaxed. He nodded. He smiled that tiny smile. "Okay," he said softly. Karen glared at him. "You better fix this," she snapped. "I'm watching you." Then she turned and stormed off, muttering to herself about how awful Jake was. Jake watched her go. He dipped his brush back in the paint and kept working, stroke, stroke, stroke. The green door looked nice. He liked it. But inside, that boiling was hotter than ever. It was bubbling so much it almost hurt. Karen kept thinking she was in charge. She kept thinking Jake was a pushover. She'd laugh to herself as she walked away, saying, "He's so weak. He'll do whatever I say." She'd tell the other HOA people about him at their meetings. "That new guy, Jake," she'd say. "He's no trouble. I've got him under control." She'd smirk and flip through her clipboard, showing off all the notes she'd written about him. She thought she was winning every fight. She thought Jake was scared of her. She thought he'd never do anything to stop her. Big mistake. Huge, giant mistake. Because Jake wasn't scared. He wasn't weak. He wasn't just sitting there taking it. Every time Karen yelled, every time she stomped on his grass, every time she scribbled in that clipboard, Jake was paying attention. He was thinking. He was planning. He'd sit on his porch after she left, sipping his lemonade or coffee, and stare at the spot where she'd been. He'd think about her words. He'd think about her steps. He'd think about that clipboard. And that boiling inside him. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was turning into something else. Something smart. Something sneaky. Something that would make Karen sorry she ever messed with him. One evening, the sun was setting, and the sky was all orange and red. Jake was in his backyard, pulling weeds from his flower bed. He liked his flowers, little yellow ones and purple ones that smelled nice. He was on his knees, digging in the dirt, when Karen showed up again. She didn't knock. She didn't say hi. She just marched right into his yard, her shoes squashing a purple flower. "Your weeds are out of control," she shouted. "And that shed, it's still here. And that mailbox still blue. You're a disgrace, Jake." She waved her clipboard in the air like a flag. Jake looked up from the dirt. His hands were muddy, but he didn't care. He nodded. He smiled that tiny smile. "I'm working on it," he said quietly. Karen laughed a mean, loud laugh. "Work faster," she snapped. "You're lucky I don't find you right now." She scribbled in her clipboard and turned to leave. "I'll be back," she called over her shoulder. Jake watched her go. His fists clenched in the dirt just for a second. Then he went back to pulling weeds. He looked calm. Too calm. But inside, that boiling was ready to explode. What was he planning? Oh, it's coming. It's coming soon. Karen thought she could keep bossing him around. She thought she was the queen of Pinewood Estates. She thought Jake was nothing. But she was wrong. So wrong. The tension was thick like a big, heavy cloud hanging over Jake's house. Something was going to happen. Something big. Something that would shake up everything. Karen didn't see it. The neighbors didn't see it. But Jake? He knew. He was ready. And it was going to be awesome. Weeks went by in Pinewood Estates, and things didn't get better for Jake Larson. They got worse. Way worse. Karen McAllister, the bossy HOA president, didn't just yell at Jake anymore. Oh no, she took it to a whole new level. She started peeking through his windows. Yup, you heard that right. She'd sneak up to his house, press her nose against the glass, and squint inside, claiming she needed to inspect for HOA rules. "I have to make sure everything's perfect," she'd say, her loud voice cutting through the quiet neighborhood. She'd scribble in her clipboard and mutter about how Jake wasn't following her rules. It was crazy. Totally crazy. One day, it got even wilder. Karen didn't just peek, she went too far. It was a sunny afternoon, and Jake was inside making a sandwich. He had bread, peanut butter, and jelly on the counter, humming a little tune. His picnic table sat outside in the backyard, just like always. Then, out of nowhere, Karen showed up. She didn't knock. She didn't call out. She just marched right into Jake's backyard like it was her own house. She had a measuring tape in her hand, a long, yellow one that stretched out with a snap. She pulled it tight and started measuring his picnic table. "This table's too big," she shouted, even though Jake couldn't hear her from inside. "It doesn't fit the rules. I'll write you up for this." Jake heard something, a loud snap and a yell. He peeked out his kitchen window and saw her. Karen, standing there, measuring his table like she was some kind of backyard detective. He dropped his peanut butter knife. His mouth opened a little. He couldn't believe it. She didn't ask. She didn't wait. She just walked in and started bossing his picnic table around. That was it. That was the moment Jake had had enough. Enough of her yelling. Enough of her stomping. Enough of her clipboard. He was done. Totally, completely done. But Jake didn't run outside and yell at her. Nope. He didn't chase her off with a broom or call her names. That wasn't Jake's way. Instead, he stayed quiet. He watched her from the window as she scribbled in her clipboard and stomped off. Then he went back to his sandwich, took a big bite, and started thinking. He chewed slowly, his brain working fast. Karen thought she was in charge. She thought she could do whatever she wanted. But Jake? He had other ideas. Sneaky ideas. Smart ideas. He wasn't going to let her win, not anymore. That night, when the moon was up and the neighborhood was dark, Jake stayed awake. He sat at his kitchen table, the one inside, not the picnic one Karen hated. He had a pencil in his hand and a big piece of paper in front of him. He started sketching something. Lines went this way, lines went that way. He drew little squares and circles. He scribbled words like wires and buttons. He even sketched a little box with a switch on it. Tap, tap, tap went his pencil on the table. Scratch, scratch, scratch went the lead on the paper. He worked late, really late, way past bedtime. The clock ticked past midnight, but Jake didn't care. He kept drawing. And as he drew, he grinned to himself. A sneaky grin. A happy grin. A grin that said, "Oh, Karen's in for a surprise." What was he sketching? Blueprints. Blueprints are like plans, like a map for building something cool. Jake was good at building things. Back where he used to live, he made birdhouses and shelves and even a little robot once. He loved figuring out how stuff worked. And now, in Pinewood Estates, he was figuring out something new: how to stop Karen. His blueprints weren't for a birdhouse this time. Nope. They were for something bigger. Something trickier. Something with wires and buttons and a little box. Something that would teach Karen a lesson. A shocking lesson. Yup, shocking. But don't jump ahead yet. We're getting there. Karen didn't know about Jake's late night sketching. She didn't have a clue. She thought she was the boss of everything. She'd march around the neighborhood, yelling at Mr. Thompson about his bike, snapping at Mrs. Garcia about her flowers, and always coming back to Jake's house to complain. She'd peek through his windows some more. She'd measure his grass with that tape. She'd write nasty notes and leave them on his porch. One note said, "Your shed's ugly. Take it down." Another said, "Blue mailbox equals fine." She thought she was winning. She thought Jake was scared. She thought he'd never fight back. Oh, how wrong she was. Jake kept his blueprints a secret. He didn't tell the neighbors. He didn't show anyone his drawings. During the day, he acted normal. He'd mow his grass, water his flowers, and sip lemonade on his porch. When Karen came by, he'd nod and smile like always. "Fix that shed," she'd yell. Jake would nod. "Change that mailbox," she'd snap. Jake would smile. But every night, when the stars came out, he'd sit at his table and work on his plan. He'd add more lines to his blueprints. He'd draw more wires. He'd sketch that little box with buttons again and again. And every time, he'd grin bigger. His plan was growing. His trap was coming together. One morning, something big happened. The sun was just peeking over the trees, and Pinewood Estates was waking up. Birds chirped. Kids got ready for school. Jake was on his porch, drinking coffee, looking at his bright blue mailbox. Then rumble, 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 a delivery truck rolled down the street. It was big and loud, with a red logo on the side. It stopped right in front of Jake's house. The driver hopped out, opened the back, and started unloading stuff. Big stuff. Tall metal poles clanged onto the ground. Rolls of wire, shiny and silver, tumbled out next. Boxes thumped onto the grass. The driver waved at Jake. "Sign here," he said. Jake signed the paper, smiling that sneaky grin again. The neighbors saw it all. Mr. Thompson peeked out his window, his coffee mug in hand. "What's Jake got?" he muttered. Mrs. Garcia pulled back her curtains, her eyes wide. "Poles? Wire? What's that for?" she whispered. Kids on their way to the bus stopped and stared. "Cool," one of them said. The whole neighborhood was buzzing quietly, though, because nobody wanted Karen to hear. They were curious. Super curious. What was Jake doing with all that stuff? Those big poles looked strong. That wire looked shiny. Those boxes looked mysterious. Something was up. Something big. But Karen? She didn't notice. Not at all. That same morning, while the truck was unloading, she was down the street, busy writing Jake another nasty note. She sat on her porch, her clipboard on her lap, scribbling away. "Your grass is patchy," she wrote. "Your shed's still there," she added. "Your mailbox is a joke," she finished. She was so focused on her mean words that she didn't hear the truck. She didn't see the poles. She didn't spot the wire. She didn't even look up when the driver drove away, rumbling past her house. She just kept writing, muttering to herself, that Jake, he's in big trouble now. Jake watched the truck leave. He stood in his yard, hands on his hips, looking at the pile of stuff. Those metal poles were taller than him. The rolls of wire gleamed in the sun. The boxes sat there, waiting to be opened. He grinned again, not a tiny smile this time, but a big one. He knew what it was all for. He knew what he was building. His blueprints were ready. His plan was set. Karen thought she was in charge, but Jake was setting a trap. A shocking trap. A trap that would make her scream and run and wish she'd never peeked through his windows or measured his table. The neighbors kept peeking. Mr. Thompson called Mrs. Garcia on the phone. "Did you see that truck?" he asked. "Yeah," she said. "What's Jake making?" They didn't know. Nobody knew except Jake. He carried the poles to his backyard, one by one. Clang, 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 they hit the ground. He dragged the wire rolls behind him. Thump, 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 they bounced on the grass. He set the boxes by his shed and wiped his hands. Then he went inside, grabbed his blueprints, and got to work. He didn't tell anyone what he was doing. He didn't explain. He just worked and grinned. Karen finished her note that morning. She folded it up, marched to Jake's house, and stuck it on his porch. "Read this," she shouted, even though he wasn't there to hear her. She didn't see the poles. She didn't spot the wire. She didn't notice the boxes. She just turned around and stomped home, thinking she'd scare Jake again. She thought she was winning. She thought he'd read her note and obey her rules. She had no idea what was really going on. No idea at all. Jake came back outside after she left. He saw the note and picked it up. He read it: grass patchy. Shed ugly. Mailbox bad. And shook his head. Then he tossed it in the trash. He didn't care about Karen's notes anymore. He didn't care about her yelling. He had his poles. He had his wire. He had his blueprints. He was ready to build something wild, something sneaky, something that would change everything. Karen thought she was the boss. She thought she could keep bossing him around. But Jake? He was done being quiet. He was done nodding and smiling. He was setting a trap, a shocking one, and it was almost ready. What was he building? Oh, you'll see. Hang on tight, because it's about to get wild. Those poles, that wire, that little box with buttons, they were all part of his plan. Karen didn't know it yet, but she was walking right into it. The neighbors didn't know either, but they were watching. Everyone was curious. Everyone was waiting. And Jake? He was grinning bigger than ever. The trap was coming. The shock was near. And Pinewood Estates was about to see something they'd never forget. The next day came fast in Pinewood Estates. The sun was shining bright, the sky was blue, and the birds were singing in the trees. It seemed like a normal day, quiet, peaceful, just like always. But something was different at Jake Larson's house. Something big. Overnight, his yard had changed. Where there used to be just grass and a picnic table, now there was a shiny new fence. It was tall, taller than Jake, taller than anyone in the neighborhood. It was sleek, made of smooth metal poles that gleamed in the sunlight. And if you listened close, really close, you could hear it buzzing. A faint little hum, like a bee flying nearby. Buzz, buzz, buzz. That fence wasn't ordinary. Oh no. It was special. Very special. Jake had worked hard to build it. All those metal poles from the delivery truck. He'd stuck them deep into the ground, one by one. Clang, 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 they went in straight and strong. All that shiny wire? He'd wrapped it around the poles, connecting it tight so it stretched across his yard like a big web. And that little box with buttons from his blueprints? He'd hooked it up too, hiding it by his shed where nobody could see. He'd stayed up late again, twisting wires, pushing buttons, making sure everything was perfect. When he finished, he stepped back, looked at his new fence, and grinned. That sneaky grin was bigger than ever. He knew what it could do. He knew it was ready. And he knew Karen wouldn't like it one bit. Karen McAllister didn't know about the fence yet. She didn't know about Jake's late-night work. She didn't know about the buzzing. That morning, she woke up grumpy, like she always did. She grabbed her clipboard, put on her shoes, and decided it was time to bother Jake again. She'd written him that nasty note the day before, grass patchy. Shed ugly. Mailbox bad. And she was sure he hadn't fixed anything. She thought he was still the same quiet guy who'd nod and smile. She thought she was still in charge. So she marched down the street, her shoes going clip-clop on the sidewalk. Her clipboard was tucked under her arm, and her eyes were narrowed. She was ready to yell. Ready to boss. Ready to win again. When she got to Jake's house, she stopped. Her mouth dropped open. She saw the fence. That tall, shiny, buzzing fence. It stretched all around his yard, blocking off his grass, his picnic table, his shed, everything. It looked strong. It looked new. It looked like something she hadn't told him to do. Karen didn't like that. Not one bit. She put her hands on her hips and glared at it. What's this? She muttered to herself. A fence? He didn't ask me about a fence. She flipped open her clipboard and started scribbling. Fence ugly. Against rules, she wrote, her pen scratching fast. She didn't hear the buzzing. She didn't think about why it was there. She just got mad. Karen stormed over as usual. She didn't knock on Jake's door. She didn't call out to him. She just marched right up to the fence, her shoes crunching on the gravel by the edge of his yard. She didn't care that it was shiny. She didn't care that it was tall. She didn't care that it was buzzing because she didn't even notice. All she saw was something new, something Jake had done without her permission. This is against regulations, she shrieked, her voice so loud it scared a bird out of a nearby tree. You can't put up a fence like this. I'm the HOA president, and I say no. She reached out with her hand, her bossy, pointing hand, and grabbed at the wire. She wanted to yank it. She wanted to pull it down. She wanted to show Jake who was boss. That's when it happened. Zap. A big, loud zap like a lightning bolt, but smaller. A jolt shot through her hand, fast and sharp. It tingled up her arm, buzzed through her body, and made her jump. Karen let out a scream, a huge, wild scream that echoed down the street. "Aw," she yelled, so loud the whole neighborhood heard it. Dogs barked. Kids ran to their windows. Mr. Thompson spilled his coffee. Mrs. Garcia dropped her watering can. That scream was loud, louder than anything Karen had ever yelled before. She stumbled back, tripping over her own feet, and landed on the ground with a thump. Her hair frizzed up, sticking out like she'd touched a balloon. Her eyes were wide, big as dinner plates. She looked shocked. Really, really shocked. Jake heard the scream. He'd been inside, sipping lemonade, waiting for this moment. He put down his glass, stood up, and walked to his door. He pushed it open and stepped outside, slow and calm. His arms were crossed over his chest, and he had a smirk on his face, a little, sneaky smirk that said, "I knew this would happen." He looked at Karen, sitting there on the ground, her clipboard in the dirt, her hair all wild. She was breathing hard, staring at the fence like it had bitten her. Jake tilted his head and said, "Oh, did I forget to mention? It's electrified. Perfectly legal, too, I checked." Karen's face turned red. Bright red, like a tomato. She scrambled to her feet, brushing dirt off her pants, but she was shaking. Her hands still tingled from the zap. She pointed at Jake, then at the fence, then at Jake again. You can't do this," she sputtered. Her voice was loud, but it wobbled a little. She wasn't so sure of herself anymore. This fence, it's dangerous. It's against the rules. I'll fine you. I'll." She stopped, her words getting stuck. She didn't know what to say. For once, Karen McAllister was speechless. Jake didn't yell back. He didn't need to. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. It was folded neat and tidy, with words printed on it. He held it up so Karen could see. "This says I can," he said, his voice calm and clear. "I checked the HOA rules. I checked the town rules. I even called the electric company. Everything's legal. This fence is mine, and it's staying." He smirked again, bigger this time. The paper was proof he'd followed every rule, every little detail. The HOA couldn't touch him. Karen couldn't touch him. For once, she had no power. Karen stared at the paper. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. She looked like a fish gasping for water. But she stammered. She couldn't finish. She grabbed her clipboard off the ground, hugged it to her chest, and glared at Jake. Her hair was still frizzy. Her face was still red. Her hands still shook a little from the zap. She wanted to yell. She wanted to argue. But she couldn't. Jake had won. He'd beaten her with his shiny, buzzing fence and his sneaky, smart plan. How's that for a twist? The neighbors saw it all. Mr. Thompson peeked out his window, his coffee forgotten. Did she just scream? He muttered. Mrs. Garcia ran to her porch, her watering can still dripping. What happened? She whispered. Kids down the street giggled and pointed. Karen got zapped, one of them shouted. The whole neighborhood was buzzing now, not like the fence, but with whispers and laughs. They couldn't believe it. Karen, the loud, bossy HOA president, had finally met her match. And Jake? Quiet, nice Jake? He was the one who did it? Karen stood there, staring at Jake. She didn't know what to do. She'd always been the one yelling, the one giving orders, the one writing nasty notes. But now she was the one who looked silly. Her clipboard didn't help her. Her rules didn't save her. That zap had changed everything. She took a step back, then another, her shoes crunching on the gravel. This isn't over, she finally shouted, but her voice wasn't as strong. It cracked a little. She turned and stomped off, faster than usual, her frizzy hair bouncing with every step. Jake watched her go. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He just stood there, arms crossed, smirking at his fence. That tall, shiny, buzzing fence. It was his trap. His shocking trap. And it had worked better than he'd ever dreamed. Karen thought she was in charge. She thought she could boss him around forever. But Jake had flipped the game. He'd built something smart, something sneaky, something legal. And now, for the first time, Karen was the one running away. The buzzing kept going, buzz, 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 soft and steady. Jake looked at it and nodded to himself. He'd checked every rule. He'd made sure it was safe, just a little zap, not a big hurt. He wasn't mean like Karen. He just wanted her to stop. And now she had. At least for today. He turned and went back inside, picking up his lemonade glass. He took a sip and grinned again. The big reveal was done. The climax had hit. And Pinewood Estates would never be the same. How's that for a twist? Karen speechless, Jake smirking, and a fence that zapped her right out of her bossy ways. The neighbors couldn't stop watching. The kids couldn't stop laughing. And Jake? He'd finally shown everyone who he really was, not just a quiet guy, but a smart one. A sneaky one. A winner. Stick around, because this story's not over yet, but oh boy, what a moment. Word spread fast in Pinewood Estates. Really, really fast. After Karen got zapped by Jake's shiny, buzzing fence, everyone heard about it. It was like a big wave rolling through the neighborhood, whispers here, giggles there, and wide eyes everywhere. Kids ran down the street, shouting, Karen screamed so loud. Dogs barked like they were excited too. Neighbors peeked out their windows, then stepped onto their porches, talking to each other about what happened. Did you hear? Mr. Thompson said to Mrs. Garcia. Jake's fence shocked her. Mrs. Garcia nodded, her watering can still in her hand. I saw it. She fell right on her butt. They laughed quietly at first, behind their hands, so Karen wouldn't hear. But oh boy, they couldn't stop smiling. Karen didn't look so tough anymore. After that big zap, she stumbled away from Jake's house, clutching her clipboard tight. That clipboard, her favorite thing, the one she always waved around, was a little singed now. Singed means it got burned a tiny bit, like when you hold paper too close to a candle. The edges were crispy, and some of her mean notes were smudged. She held it close to her chest, her face red and her hair still frizzy from the shock. She didn't march like usual. No clip-clop down the sidewalk. Nope. She sulked. Sulk means she walked slow and sad, her head down, her shoulders slumped. She looked like a kid who'd lost a game. For once, Karen McAllister didn't feel like the boss. Jake stood on his porch, watching her go. His arms were crossed, and that sneaky smirk was still on his face. His new fence, tall, shiny, and buzzing, stood proud in his yard. Buzz, 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 it hummed softly, like it was happy too. Jake didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just watched Karen sulk away, her shoes dragging on the ground. He knew what he'd done. He'd built that fence with his blueprints, his poles, his wire, and his little box of buttons. He'd set a trap, a shocking trap, and it worked. Karen had bossed him around for weeks, peeking through his windows, measuring his picnic table, yelling about his grass and shed and blue mailbox. But now she was leaving. And she wasn't coming back, not today, at least. The neighbors couldn't believe it. They'd seen Karen stomping around Pinewood Estates forever. She'd yell at Mr. Thompson about his bike. She'd snap at Mrs. Garcia about her pink flowers. She'd write nasty notes and wave that clipboard like she was the queen. And Jake? They'd seen her yell at him the most. "Your grass is too long," she'd say. "Your shed's ugly," she'd shout. "Fix that mailbox," she'd scream. They thought Jake was just a quiet guy, a nice guy who'd never fight back. They felt bad for him, whispering, "Poor Jake," when Karen stormed over. But now they saw something different. Jake wasn't just quiet. He was smart. Really, really smart. And he'd outsmarted Karen, the queen of nosiness, in the best way ever. That week, the HOA had a meeting. It was on Wednesday night, in the little community room down the street. All the grown ups in Pinewood Estates went: Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Garcia, and even Karen, the president. Normally, Karen ran those meetings like a big show. She'd stand up front, bang her clipboard on the table, and tell everyone what to do. "No bikes on porches," she'd say. "Red flowers only," she'd demand. And she'd always talk about Jake. "That new guy's breaking rules," she'd complain. "His shed's awful. His mailbox is blue. I'm handling it." She'd smirk and scribble in her clipboard, acting like she was fixing everything. But this time was different. Karen showed up to the meeting, but she didn't look happy. She sat in her chair, her clipboard on her lap, and stayed quiet. Her hair was still a little frizzy, even days later. Her face was still a little red, like she couldn't forget that zap. The neighbors noticed. They peeked at her from their seats, whispering to each other. "She's not yelling," Mr. Thompson said. "She's not bossing," Mrs. Garcia added. And when it was time to talk about Jake, because someone always brought him up, Karen didn't say a word. Someone asked, "What about that fence?" Karen's eyes got wide. She shook her head fast. "Nothing," she muttered. "It's fine." She didn't dare mention Jake. Not his fence. Not his yard. Not anything. Why? Because she knew. She'd seen that paper Jake held up, the one that said his fence was legal. She'd tried to argue, sputtering, "You can't do this." But Jake had proof. He'd checked every rule. He'd made sure the HOA couldn't touch him. That fence wasn't just a trap, it was a winner. And Karen couldn't fight it. For once, she had to shut up. The neighbors saw it all. They saw her sit there, quiet and small, not bossing anyone. They couldn't believe it. Karen, the loudest lady in Pinewood Estates, was finally speechless. And Jake? He wasn't even there. He didn't need to be. His fence did the talking for him. That fence stayed up. Day after day, it stood tall in Jake's yard, buzzing quietly. Buzz, buzz, buzz. It was like a little song, a warning to anyone who'd cross him. The metal poles shone in the sun. The wire stretched tight and strong. The little box with buttons stayed hidden by the shed, ready to zap if it had to. Nobody messed with it. Nobody dared. Kids would ride their bikes past Jake's house and point. "That's the zap fence," they'd say, giggling. Karen got shocked. Dogs would sniff near it, then back away fast. Even the birds seemed to know they didn't land on it. That fence was Jake's guard, his shield, his big win. People started looking at Jake differently. Before, they'd ignored him. He was just the new guy, quiet, nice, nothing special. They'd wave hello sometimes, but they didn't really know him. They thought he was weak because Karen yelled at him so much. Poor Jake, they'd say. He can't stand up to her. But now they saw the truth. Jake wasn't weak. He was clever. He'd built that fence all by himself, with his blueprints and his sneaky grin. He'd outsmarted the queen of nosiness, the lady nobody else could stop. And they liked that. They liked it a lot. Mr. Thompson started nodding to Jake when he saw him. Nice fence, he'd say, tipping his hat. Mrs. Garcia would smile from her porch. Good job, Jake, she'd call, watering her pink flowers. Kids would wave as they rode by. Cool zapper, they'd shout. Even the mailman, who used to just drop letters and go, stopped one day. Heard about Karen, he said to Jake. That's awesome. Jake would nod back, smiling, not that tiny smile anymore, but a big, happy one. People didn't ignore him now. They respected him. The guy they'd forgotten? He was a hero in Pinewood Estates. Karen stopped trespassing after that. Trespassing means going where you're not supposed to, like into Jake's yard. Before, she'd march right in, peek through his windows, measure his table, stomp on his grass. She didn't care. She thought she owned everything. But after that zap? Nope. She stayed away. She'd walk down the street, her clipboard under her arm, and keep her eyes straight ahead. She wouldn't even look at Jake's house. If she had to pass by, she'd speed up, clip-clop, super fast until she was gone. That buzzing fence scared her. That little shock was all it took. One zap, one scream, and Karen learned her lesson. Days turned into weeks, and the neighborhood settled down. The sun kept shining, the birds kept singing, and Jake kept living his quiet life. He'd sit on his porch with lemonade, wave to the neighbors, and watch his fence buzz. He didn't need to build anything else. He didn't need to fight anymore. He'd won. Karen didn't bother him, not with notes, not with yells, not with anything. She'd sulk on her own porch, scribbling in her singed clipboard, but she left Jake alone. The queen of nosiness was quiet now. And Jake? He was happy. The neighbors talked about it all the time. Remember when Karen got zapped? Mr. Thompson would say, laughing. She screamed so loud. Mrs. Garcia would nod. Jake's so smart. That fence is perfect. Kids made up stories about it. The zap fence is magic, they'd say, riding their bikes in circles. It protects Jake from the mean lady. Everyone loved it. Everyone felt good. Justice was served. Justice means when the right thing happens, when the bad guy loses and the good guy wins. Karen had been mean for too long. She'd bossed and yelled and trespassed. But Jake stopped her. He served justice with a buzz and a zap, and it felt awesome. So, viewer, what do you think? Did Karen get what she deserved? Imagine you're in Pinewood Estates. Imagine you saw that zap, heard that scream, watched Karen sulk away. Was it fair? Did Jake do the right thing? Drop your answer in the comments below. I want to know. Tell me if you'd build a zap fence too, or if you'd cheer for Jake like the neighbors did. This story's all about standing up to mean people, and Jake did it in the coolest way. Let's talk about it. Jake's fence kept buzzing, quiet and steady. Karen stayed away, sulking and silent. The neighbors kept smiling, nodding to Jake with respect. Pinewood Estates was peaceful again thanks to one smart guy and his shocking trap. Justice was served, and it couldn't have been better. What a win. In the end, Jake Larson proved something big in Pinewood Estates. Something really, really big. He showed everyone that you don't have to be loud to win. Nope. You don't have to yell or shout or stomp around like Karen did. You don't have to wave a clipboard or boss people around. Sometimes, the smartest moves, the best moves happen in silence. Quiet moves? Sneaky moves? Moves that surprise everyone and make them say, wow. Jake wasn't loud. He wasn't mean. He was just smart. And that's how he beat Karen, the queen of nosiness, with his buzzing fence and his sneaky grin. Think about it. Karen was loud all the time. She'd march into Jake's yard, yelling, "Your grass is too long." She'd peek through his windows, shouting, "Fix that shed." She'd measure his picnic table and scream, "This is against the rules." Her voice was big. Her steps were big. Her clipboard was big. She pushed hard, really hard, trying to make Jake do what she wanted. She thought being loud made her strong. She thought yelling made her the boss. But guess what? She was wrong. The ones who push too hard, like Karen did, are the ones who get burned. Or in her case zapped. Zap. One little shock, and all her loudness didn't matter anymore. Jake didn't yell back. He didn't argue. He didn't fight her with words. He stayed quiet. He nodded. He smiled that tiny smile. But inside, he was thinking. He was planning. He drew his blueprints late at night, scratch, scratch, scratch with his pencil. He built his fence with those big poles and shiny wire, clang, clang, clang in his yard. He hooked up that little box with buttons, buzz, 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 and waited. He didn't need to be loud. He didn't need to push. He just needed to be smart. And when Karen grabbed that fence, zap, she found out the hard way. Quiet can be stronger than loud. Smart can beat bossy. Jake proved it. So what does that mean for you? Let's think about it together. Maybe you know someone like Karen. Maybe there's a kid at school who's always loud, always telling you what to do. Give me your pencil, they might say. Sit here, not there, they might yell. Or maybe there's a grown-up, a teacher, a coach, a neighbor who pushes you around. You're not good enough, they might say. Do it my way, they might shout. It feels bad when people step all over you like that. It feels like they're big and you're small, like they're strong and you're weak. But here's the secret Jake showed us: you don't have to feel small. You don't have to let them win. Next time someone tries to boss you around, remember Jake. Picture him on his porch, sipping lemonade, smiling that sneaky smile. Picture his fence tall, shiny, buzzing, ready to zap anyone who goes too far. You don't have to yell at the bossy person. You don't have to cry or run away. You can be like Jake. You can stay quiet, think smart, and find your own way to stand up. Maybe you don't build a real fence with wires and buttons, though that would be pretty cool. But you can build your own fence inside you. A strong fence. A brave fence. A fence that says, nope, you can't push me anymore. Let's imagine it. Say a kid at school takes your spot in line. They push you and say, I'm first. You could yell back, no, I was here. But that's loud, like Karen. Instead, try Jake's way. Stay calm. Smile a little. Then walk to the teacher and say, he took my spot. Quiet. Smart. Strong. Or maybe your big sister keeps taking your toys. She grabs your favorite truck and says, mine now. You could scream, give it back. But what would Jake do? He'd wait. He'd think. Maybe he'd hide her favorite doll until she trades. Sneaky, right? That's your fence, your way to say no without being loud. Jake's story teaches us something cool. You don't need a big voice to be big. You don't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes, the quiet kids, the ones who think, who plan, who wait, are the strongest of all. Karen didn't see it coming. She thought Jake was weak because he didn't fight her right away. She thought his nods and smiles meant he was scared. But he wasn't scared. He was building. He was winning. And when that fence zapped her zap, she learned the truth. The quiet guy had the power all along. Let's picture Jake one more time. He's sitting on his porch in Pinewood Estates. The sun's shining, the birds are chirping, and his fence is buzzing, buzz, buzz, buzz. Karen's far away, sulking on her own porch, her clipboard all singed. The neighbors are waving to Jake, saying, good job. He sips his lemonade and smiles, not a tiny smile now, but a big, happy one. He didn't yell. He didn't push. He just stayed sharp, smart, and quick, and stayed strong, brave, and tough. He built his fence, set his trap, and won. That's what you can do too. What's your fence? Think about it. Maybe it's saying no when someone's mean. Maybe it's doing something smart to fix a problem. Maybe it's waiting for the right time to show you're tough. You don't have to be loud like Karen. You don't have to push people around. You can be like Jake, quiet, sneaky, strong. Next time someone tries to step all over you, don't get mad and shout. Don't give up and cry. Remember Jake. Build your own fence, your own way to stand tall, and watch the bossy ones run away. Let's try a little game. Imagine you're at school. A big kid takes your ball at recess. He laughs and says, "It's mine now." What do you do? Do you yell? Do you run to the teacher crying? Or do you try Jake's way? Maybe you wait. Maybe you grab his water bottle when he's not looking and say, "Trade me." Quiet. Smart. Strong. That's your fence. Or maybe at home, your brother keeps changing the TV channel when you're watching something. "My turn," he says. You could scream, "No, it's mine." But Jake wouldn't. Maybe you hide the remote next time and smile. Sneaky, right? That's how you win without being loud. Jake's story isn't just fun, it's a lesson. A big, cool lesson. It says you're stronger than you think. Even if you're quiet. Even if you're small. Even if someone's mean to you. You don't have to fight like they do. You can fight like Jake, with brains, with patience, with a little sneaky grin. Karen pushed too hard, and she got burned, well, zapped. The ones who boss and yell? They don't always win. The quiet ones, the smart ones, the strong ones, they do. Just like Jake. So stay sharp, okay? Sharp means smart and quick, like Jake with his blueprints. Keep your eyes open. Think about what you can do. And stay strong. Strong means brave and tough, like Jake with his fence. Don't let the Karens of the world push you down. Build your own fence, your own way to say, "Nope, not today." It doesn't have to buzz or zap. It just has to be yours. Something that makes you feel big, even if you're quiet. Something that makes the bossy ones back off. I'll see you in the next story, alright? We've got more fun stuff coming, more traps, more zaps, more wins. But for now, think about Jake. Think about his fence. Think about how he stayed quiet but won big. You can do that too. You don't need to be loud. You don't need to push. You just need to be you, smart, strong, and ready. So next time someone tries to step all over you, what will you do? Build your fence. Stay sharp. Stay strong. And smile, because you've got this.